Building out the rest of season rankings, it's kind of insane that there's only a top tier of 2 options in my mind between Jamar Chase as well as Justin Jefferson in comparison to where you look at running back and there are like 8 elite level options. Here, Chase obviously has been by far and away the best wide receiver in fantasy so far this season. The only reason I would even consider Jefferson maybe in the same tier is if I'm trying not to be super biased here. Obviously, I have Chase in the flock league. Chase is standing alone at this point. At least with Jefferson, he's already through the bye week. Dropping down to our second tier, A.J. Brown is through the bye as well. But what's actually funny is with A.J. Brown, you have 2 games this season with more than 20 fantasy points. Like A.J. Brown actually hasn't been a super consistent fantasy play. Nico Collins, obviously, when he's healthy, has been phenomenal. The thing with Collins is you still have the bye week in week 14. If you gave me a 100% guarantee that Nico Collins was playing week 11, which he probably is, I think you put Nico Collins probably in tier 1 right beside Jefferson. I just want to be a little bit hesitant because I thought he was playing this past week and clearly I was wrong. Tyreek Hill maybe plays tonight. We will see. Obviously, I'm going to be live streaming after the game tonight, trying to figure out everything that happened and updating these rankings yet again. I will say, last I checked, I believe Underdog Fantasy had Tyreek Hill higher, lower, about 77.5 receiving yards. If you are interested in taking either higher or lower there, you can find the link to Underdog Fantasy in the description and comment section. If you use code FLOCK, you'll actually be able to pair a free Matthew Stafford pick more than less than half a total yard for Monday night's game. And on top of it, you'll be getting a free team review as long as you use code FLOCK on Underdog Fantasy. But anyway, with Tyreek, obviously, the man's been bad. You've had 1 game this season with more than 20 fantasy points. But to be fair, you've only played 3 games with a fully healthy Tua from start to finish. And in those 3 games, Tyreek is averaging about 17 points per contest. Amon-Ra St. Brown really looked like he wasn't going to do anything against Houston Texans. He comes through with the receiving touchdown late. What's actually really funny with St. Brown is if you look at the past 5 weeks that he has played, or I apologize, the last 7 weeks that he has played, you have had 0 games with more than 8 targets, but every single game he has scored a touchdown. It is insane. The touchdown rate's through the roof. Obviously, this is an elite level offense, but the receiving volume really hasn't been there. It's just been the touchdowns. Now, going over to our next name, we are going to be looking at London. With London, obviously, he was lower in our rest of season rankings in the video last week just because I didn't know if that hip injury was going to be lingering. But nope, looks like London is good to go. The only hesitation you have is he has the bye week in week 12, but the passing volume has been great in Atlanta. Super safe to call London a mid-wide receiver 1. Malik Nabers, I think it's safe to call him a wide receiver 1 as well. What's crazy with Nabers is if we just get out a little napkin here and do some napkin math, the man's averaging 12, 13 targets a game. He should be by far and away the number 1 receiver in the NFL in targets per game. But obviously the issue that you have here is Daniel Jones in this offense has just been horrendous. If you have Nabers, you'd almost rather see Jones benched coming out of the bye week. Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua will be our next 2 names. Obviously, Kupp's been phenomenal over the past 2 weeks, but you've only seen Puka play 57 and 35% of the snaps. So I think it's very difficult to look at the Kupp usage that you had in weeks 8 and 9 and say that's what we're going to expect 100% going into the future, where I think Puka could expand his role here. Garrett Wilson will lead off the next tier. We talked about this a lot, but if you're looking at Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, they are like the AFC version of Puka and Kupp in that this is an offense where everything is concentrated between those 2 receivers, especially with Lazard on the IR. The issue is just Aaron Rodgers isn't nearly as good as Matthew Stafford at this point of their respective careers. DK Metcalf will be our next wide receiver. Obviously, my expectations here ranking Metcalf at 12 is for Metcalf to be 100% healthy coming out of the bye week in week 10, which for me, that is what I'm expecting personally. In reality, I think you could move Metcalf behind Debo very easily. Debo this past week against Tampa, it was a phenomenal matchup. He didn't really do much though. It is frustrating that since Debo missed time in week 3, you've only seen him have 1 game with more than 6 targets, and that was with 7. So the last time you saw Debo Samuel with 8 or more targets was back in week 2. Obviously, Jennings looked great in place of Ayuk, but I still think Debo's the wide receiver one in this offense. Mike Evans, I really hope we get some positive news regarding the hamstring soon. But obviously, Evans has moved up these rankings dramatically over the past few weeks because every week you get closer to returning from that injury, you'll be higher, higher, and higher. Evans suffered the hamstring injury back in week 7. You have the bye week in week 11. So he's going to miss this next week regardless. And Evans potentially can come back in week 12. And if Evans comes back to this offense with no Godwin, it's very easy to see Evans actually moving up to tier 2 in these rankings. I just want to get some more information about the hamstring before we push him there. CeeDee Lamb will be our next play. I know last week we got more hate than anything for ranking CeeDee Lamb down as a wide receiver 2, saying how bad the offense was going to be with no Dak Prescott. You look at the top comment on the Flex video, top comment on the injury news live stream, whatever the hell you want to see. You can just see people hating on me for it. But again, don't hate the messenger. It's the world we're living in. This Dallas Cowboys offense is very, very bad now. Were you excited to play Tyreek with no Tua? Are you excited to play Brian Thomas with no Lawrence? No, you're not. I don't know who told you that Cooper Rush was some great quarterback. Cooper Rush is not a great quarterback. Nobody's going to come in to save the day with this Dallas Cowboys offense. It's kind of over. Based off of volume, Lamb's probably still someone you start every single week and definitely has the upside to be a wide receiver 1. I'd be surprised if he's the wide receiver 6 this week. But I don't think you're going to rank him there as that elite wide receiver based off how bad this offense is. Devontae Adams will be the next play. With Adams, he actually dominates targets over Garrett Wilson this past week. I mean, Adams over the past 2 weeks is sitting with 24 targets. He's just been so much more inefficient than what you've had with Garrett Wilson. Or even since he's been with the Jets, you've had one game with 60 or more receiving yards. You're looking at 30, 54, 91, and 31. And I mean, it's kind of crazy too, because the man's averaging like 10 targets a game. Terry McLaurin will be the next player. With McLaurin, I think you could even have him higher than this. Obviously, the reason we do these as tier list is you can move Terry McLaurin all the way up to 11. I'm not going to argue with you, to be honest. With McLaurin, you have one game with 10 or more targets. Obviously, the passing volume isn't crazy high by any means with Daniels. It's a great rushing offense. It's great offense in general with Jaden Daniels. But with those quarterbacks that are going to run the ball, they are going to monopolize some points. And McLaurin still has to go through the bye week in week 14 as well. But McLaurin has been great. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we're going to be going with Jaden Reed. With Reed, the main issue that you have, of course, is the fact that you just don't consistently see the target volume. This is an offense where you have so many different wide receivers that are going to spread the ball around. Now, of course, it's a phenomenal offense with Jordan Love under center. And Love should be 100% healthy coming out of the bye week. So I think Reed's probably still a must-start option every single week. But you are just banking on spike weeks and big plays. DeAndre Hopkins will be the next option here. Obviously, Hopkins, very disappointing week against the Denver Broncos this past week with only 56 receiving yards and 4 receptions. But still, it was a horrendous matchup going up against the Broncos here. Obviously, they are very effective at shutting down opposing wide receiver ones. And you actually do have DeAndre Hopkins playing a season high percentage of snaps with the Kansas City Chiefs, where that is just trending in the right direction consistently. Marvin Harrison Jr. will be our next name. With Harrison, obviously, it was great. He had a tough matchup against the Jets, but you still see the touchdown come through. But Harrison's just been a wildly inconsistent wide receiver so far this season, right? I don't want to go, oh, he only had 5 targets this week, blah, 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 because ultimately it was a game, of course, where the Cardinals didn't have to throw the ball aggressively. They were able to run the ball over and over and over again. But Harrison could get better as the season goes on, of course, as you'd expect most rookies to. Devonta Smith will be our next option. With Smith, I have him in the flock league, and I'm very much concerned, to be honest. If we look at since he's come back from his injury, you've seen 4, 2, 7, 6, and 3 targets. Previously, he was saving the day fantasy-related wise because you had the receiving touchdowns there. But now you have Dallas Goedert coming in and taking a receiving touchdown away. And obviously, this is kind of a rush-first offense, so I'm definitely worried about Smith at this point. George Pickens will be our next name. With Pickens, been much better with Russ under center. Like if you're looking over the past 3 weeks, you've seen 111, 74, and 91 receiving yards. So Pickens continuing to trend in the right direction. T. Higgins, I think, could be higher in these rankings as well if you had confirmation that he was going to be good to go from the quad. Because if you take a step backwards, you can see that Higgins was averaging about 9 targets a game in an offense with some of the best quarterback play in the NFL, and an offense that should be at the very top of the NFL in passing yards per game and passing touchdowns per game. But he still had the bye week in week 12. So if Higgins isn't 100%, it wouldn't be the most surprising thing in the world to see Higgins miss week 11 and then you get the bye week in week 12 for him to come back in week 13 at 100%. Because obviously the Bengals are out of it at this point. Zay Flowers will be the next play. With Flowers, up and down option that you can see a massive spike from. But the issue is, like you see this past week against Cincy, you have all the passing volume in the world from Lamar Jackson, and you get 7.5 points for Flowers. So he's very much been inconsistent so far this season. You've had some massive spikes. Now, of course, you do have the bye week in week 14, and we are going to assume that Deontay Johnson is getting more involved starting this week. Amari Cooper will be the next play. And with Amari, kind of bad news, good news situation in that it looks like Keon's probably going to be missing time going into the future, but Amari himself isn't 100%. It has been nice, though, that he's been at practice, even if that is in a limited capacity, because by the time he is fully healthy and he is into this offense, I don't think that we should see him limited with the amount of snaps, the amount of routes that he gets, because he should be fully acclimated to the playbook and should have a ton of reps in practice with Josh Allen at this point. And then Josh Downs will be our next name. If you're looking at our weekly rankings, Downs is probably going to be higher than this, but you still have to go through the bye week in week 14. And at the same time, if Michael Pittman Jr. does come back into this offense, Downs probably slides down just a little bit here. But clearly the target volume has been there, and we'd assume that the passing offense is fine with Flacco under center. Now going down to our next tier, again, don't shoot the messenger. I'm sorry, I have to remind everybody, no Trevor Lawrence means this Jacksonville Jaguars offense is very bad. If you look at the historical data, we talk about this every single offseason, wide receivers in some of the league's worst offenses are going to have a very difficult time producing in fantasy. Now, obviously, there's a big difference between having Skylar Thompson, Mac Jones, or Cooper Rush at quarterback than even Daniel Jones for the Giants. Like, the Giants are a bad offense, but I still have more faith in the Giants offense than I do the Cowboys or the Jags offense at this point. And what's crazy too is the last time that you had 5 or more targets for Brian Thomas here was back in week 7. Now, Jackson Smith-Njigba will be our next option. JSN is absolutely crushed. I mean, if you look over the past 2 weeks, JSN's come out and he's averaging 20 points a game. But also what has happened over the past 2 weeks, he had no DK Metcalf. So with Metcalf coming back in, we'd expect the target volume probably falls a bit for JSN. But to be fair to Jackson Smith-Njigba, of course, I mean, he is 100% have already cemented himself as the guy over Tyler Lockett. Darnell Mooney has been great. If you're looking at Mooney, it's very clear if you get a very strong performance from Kirk Cousins, where if Kirk Cousins comes out and he has 300 plus passing yards, Darnell Mooney is 100% going to be a must-start option. And honestly, you could make an argument to have Mooney even higher than this in these rankings. He is wide receiver 12 in total fantasy points this year. Ladd McConkey will be our next play. Issue with Ladd is, while you typically expect the young rookie receiver that's been efficient to expand his role as the season goes on, the man's already playing about the most snaps you can expect. He's already looking at a crazy high target share, and he's led this Chargers team in targets so far this season. But this is a Chargers team that's looking to run the ball over and over and over again. So, I mean, really, Ladd is a matchup play. DJ Moore will be our next name. I do think that DJ Moore is the wide receiver 1 in Chicago. And you do have some matchups coming into the future where the Bears are really not going to be able to run the ball, where you are going to have to see a ton of Caleb Williams dropbacks. But whether you want to blame the offensive line, whether you want to blame the offensive coordinator, whether you want to blame Caleb Williams himself, it doesn't really matter who you blame. The fact of the matter is this Bears offense is looking like an absolute train wreck at this point. The last time DJ Moore scored at least 10 fantasy points in a game was back in week 5. Now, our next option will be Calvin Ridley. With Ridley, obviously, the target volume since the bye week has been insane. The man's gone out there and he's averaging 10 targets a game. Now, of course, he's been very inefficient with these, but since you've had no DeAndre Hopkins, you've had 22, 12, and 25 fantasy points. So the volume's there, even if it's a garbage offense. Ridley looks viable. Jalen Waddle definitely doesn't look startable at this point. The only reason I'm even giving Waddle the benefit of the doubt and putting him here at 33 is just on the off chance if this Tyreek Hill injury is serious. But obviously, we're going to have a lot more information tonight, and we will live stream after the game and update these rankings for you to see. And we'll also update them on flockfantasy.com if you're not able to make it out to the live stream. Jacoby Myers will be the next play. Looking at Myers, the last 3 games you've seen, he's had double-digit fantasy points. Obviously, the last 2 games you've seen, you had no Devontae Adams. And in those contests, he averaged 9 targets a game. He averaged about 75 receiving yards a game, gave you a receiving touchdown as well. So Myers is another one of these guys that should have a lot of target volume in a garbage offense, but you do have Bowers with the red zone role. Tank Dell will be the next option. With Tank Dell, over the past 2 weeks, you had no Nico Collins, so you had 9 targets each game. But even this past week against the Lions, where you had a bunch of CJ Stroud pass attempts, where typically the Lions defense is one where you can throw the ball, but you can't run it against them. Tank Dell still does absolutely nothing, and we're expecting Nico back this next week. Juwan Jennings is 100% trending in the right direction here. Juwan Jennings has 11 targets in this game against the Bucs. Now, obviously, it was a perfect matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It is very difficult to come out here and say that Brock Purdy is going to have more than 350 passing yards every game going into the future. Probably see that scale back just a bit. Khalil Shakir will be much higher than this in our rankings this week if Amari Cooper were to miss. Obvious expectations at the moment is you have no Keon Coleman, but I am thinking that Amari will be back. But obviously, we said that last week too, and we were wrong. Courtland Sutton is on a little bit of a heater. You go through and look at the last 4 weeks. You had the goose egg against the Saints, but since then, he's averaged 10 targets a game. Since then, he's averaged almost 100 receiving yards a game, and he's averaged almost 20 fantasy points a game. We actually have the worst team in the league. One of the developers of flockfantasy.com in the Flock League took down my own team 2 weeks ago and now takes down Avery this week. And a big reason for this is because he has Courtland Sutton, who's been phenomenal. Sutton definitely trending the right direction, can continue to move upwards. Chris Olave goes on the IR in week 10, so he misses week 10, but he's also going to miss week 11. Then you have the bye week in week 12, which doesn't count for his IR stint. And Olave is going to miss weeks 13 and 14. That's at the minimum. The earliest Olave could potentially come back would be week 15. But Olave and this team's clearly playing for nothing at this point. I don't even know why Olave would come back. And then Cedric Tillman will be the option at 40. I know obviously a lot of people are a lot higher on Tillman than I am. Understandably so. We're Tillman over the past 3 weeks since Jameis has taken over. And since obviously Amari has been dealt, the man's averaging over 10 targets a game. The man's sitting here with 3 touchdowns over the past 3 weeks and averaging over 20 fantasy points a game. So obviously Tillman with Winston has been significantly better than this. And he's through his bye week already as well. But I think that's all I got for you. I really hope I was able to help you out with this. And of course, if you want to tell me whether or not you're taking Tyreek Hill higher or lower, 77.5 total yards, you can find that on Underdog Fantasy. But my main thing is I'd be taking the Matthew Stafford higher than half a passing yard for tonight's game. You can get that free pick over there on Underdog with code FLOCK. Code FLOCK's also going to give you a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000 and a free team review over there on flockfantasy.com. Just make sure you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your account on Underdog Fantasy. That way we can hook you up with that free team review voucher. But thank you again. I really appreciate you, and I really hope we get to see you out with the live stream tonight.